The smell of burning reaches him first. Cordite and timber, brick dust and something else. Something organic he doesn't want to name. Winston Churchill stands on the rooftop of the Air Ministry building in the darkness, 70 yards above the streets of London, watching his capital burn. It's September 7th, 1940, and the Luftwaffe has been coming every night for a week now. The sky to the east glows orange, and he can hear the crump of bombs, feel them in his chest, a bass note that never quite stops. His security detail wants him inside, underground, but he refuses. He needs to see this, needs to witness what his people are enduring. Below, in the streets, he knows what's happening. Families huddled in Anderson shelters in their gardens, packed into underground stations, pressed against the walls as the earth shakes. He's visited them, walked through the rubble in the mornings, seen the rescue workers pulling bodies from collapsed houses. Yesterday, a woman in the East End grabbed his hand and wouldn't let go. She'd lost her husband, her home, everything, but she looked him in the eye and said, "We can take it, sir. Give it back to them." He'd wept then, couldn't help it, tears running down his face as he stood in the ruins of her street. But tonight, watching the fires spread, he feels something else alongside the grief. Fear. Not for himself. He's made his peace with death. Has courted it in a dozen wars across 3 continents. He fears for Britain. For the first time since taking office in May, he allows himself to truly consider the possibility that they might lose, that Hitler might win, that everything, all of it, the centuries of history, the defiance, the refusal to bend, might end here, in fire and rubble in the autumn of 1940. The mathematics are brutal. The Luftwaffe has over 1,300 bombers. The RAF has perhaps 600 fighters left, and that number shrinks every day. The pilots are exhausted, flying 4, 5, 6 sorties a day, falling asleep in their cockpits between missions. Some are teenagers, boys with barely 20 hours of flight training, thrown into combat against experienced German aces. They're dying faster than they can be replaced. And now Hitler has switched tactics. Instead of attacking the airfields, trying to destroy the RAF on the ground, he's bombing the cities. Bombing London, trying to break British morale, to make the people demand surrender. Churchill doesn't know if it will work. He wants to believe in British resilience, in that stubborn quality he spent his life celebrating in his speeches and his histories. But he's also a student of war, and he knows that every nation has a breaking point. Even Britain, even now. A fresh wave of bombers comes in from the east, and the anti-aircraft guns open up, orange tracers arcing into the darkness. He watches a bomber caught in searchlight beams, tiny and fragile looking against the sky, and then it's gone, swallowed by clouds and darkness. The bombs fall anyway. He counts the seconds between the whistle and the impact, a habit he's developed. 4 seconds. Close, perhaps half a mile away. The building shudders slightly. His private secretary, John Colville, appears at his elbow. Young, efficient, worried. "Prime Minister, perhaps we should go below." Churchill doesn't move. In a moment. His voice is rough, thick with emotion and cigar smoke. "I need to see what they see, what our people face." What he doesn't say, what he can't say even to Colville, is that he's searching for something in the flames. Some sign, some indication that Britain will survive this. That his decision to fight on, alone if necessary, wasn't a catastrophic mistake that will end with the destruction of everything he loves. He had refused Hitler's peace offers in June after France fell, stood before Parliament and promised they would never surrender, that they would fight on the beaches, in the streets, in the hills. The words had come easily then, in the immediate aftermath of Dunkirk, when the alternative seemed worse than death. But now, 2 months later, with London burning every night, with the casualty lists growing, with invasion barges massing across the Channel, the weight of that decision crushes him. What if he was wrong? What if he's condemned Britain to destruction out of his own stubborn pride, his romantic notions of British greatness? What if the sensible thing, the merciful thing, would have been to negotiate, to find some accommodation with Hitler that would spare his people this nightly horror? Another explosion, closer this time, and he feels the blast wave wash over him. Colville flinches, but Churchill stands firm, watching the new fire bloom to the south. Somewhere near Westminster, he thinks. Perhaps the Houses of Parliament. The thought should terrify him, but instead he feels a strange calm settling over him. If Parliament burns, they'll meet somewhere else. If Buckingham Palace burns, the king will carry on. If London itself burns to ashes, Britain will still exist. The question isn't whether buildings will survive. The question is whether the nation's will to fight will survive. He thinks of the woman in the East End, her hand gripping his, her voice steady despite her losses. "We can take it, sir." Not "I can take it." We. That collective determination, that sense of shared burden. It's either real or it's the most dangerous delusion he's ever believed in. The all-clear sounds at dawn, and Churchill finally goes below, to the war rooms, to the maps and the casualty reports and the endless decisions. The numbers are worse than he feared. 364 killed last night, nearly 1,400 injured. And this was just one night. The Germans will come again tonight, and the night after, and the night after that. How long can London endure this? How long before the people break, before they demand an end to the war at any price? He sleeps for 3 hours, wakes to more bad news. The Luftwaffe has shifted tactics again, now hitting the docks, trying to strangle British trade. The East End is being systematically destroyed. Working-class neighborhoods, narrow streets, houses packed together, perfect targets for incendiary bombs. The fires spread faster than they can be fought. Whole streets vanish in a single night. But Churchill also receives other reports, ones that give him pause. The people aren't breaking. They're angry, yes. Frightened, certainly. But they're not demanding surrender. They're demanding revenge. The letters flooding into Downing Street don't beg for peace. They demand that the RAF bomb Berlin harder, that Britain hit back with everything it has. The mood in the shelters, according to his observers, isn't despair. It's defiant rage. He wants to believe these reports, but he's also aware that people tell him what he wants to hear. He needs to see for himself. So he goes out again, into the bombed neighborhoods, walking through rubble that's still warm from the fires. The scenes are apocalyptic. Entire blocks reduced to ruins, families picking through the wreckage for anything salvageable, bodies still being pulled from collapsed shelters, the smell of death everywhere. But he also sees something else: organization, resilience. The WVS women serving tea from mobile canteens. Rescue workers, many of them volunteers, working with desperate efficiency. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers sharing what little they have. And when people recognize him, they don't curse him for bringing this horror upon them. They cheer, they wave, they call out encouragement. "Give 'em hell, Winston. We're with you. Don't you worry about us." He cries again, can't help it, standing in a bombed-out street in Stepney, surrounded by people who have lost everything but haven't lost their spirit. An old woman, must be 80, sees his tears and pats his arm. There, dear. We'll be all right. You just keep us fighting." It's September 11th, and he makes a radio broadcast that evening, speaking directly to the British people. His voice is steady, measured, but underneath there's steel. These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes, by killing large numbers of civilians and women and children, that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city. Little does he know the spirit of the British nation or the tough fiber of the Londoners. As he speaks these words, he realizes he's not just trying to convince the British people, he's trying to convince himself, trying to believe that what he saw in the streets today was real, not just a temporary surge of emotion that will fade when the bombing continues. He needs proof. He needs something concrete to tell him that Britain will survive this. The proof comes 4 days later, though he doesn't recognize it immediately for what it is. September 15th, a Sunday. Churchill decides to visit RAF 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge, the nerve center controlling the fighter squadrons defending London. He wants to see how the system works, how the young men in the operations room track the incoming raids, how they decide which squadrons to scramble, where to send them. He descends into the underground operations room, takes a seat in the gallery overlooking the plotting table, and watches the system in action. The morning is quiet. Then, around 11:30, the plots begin appearing on the table. Raids forming over France. Big raids. The girls with their magnetic rods push the markers across the map, showing the German formations approaching the coast. More plots, more formations. Churchill leans forward, watching intently. This isn't a normal raid. This is everything the Luftwaffe has. A maximum effort. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, stands beside the plotting table, his face tense but controlled. He's scrambling squadrons, sending them up to intercept, but the German formations keep coming. More plots appear. The board shows squadron after squadron engaged, fighting over Kent, over Surrey, over the approaches to London. Every available fighter is in the air. Churchill watches the colored lights on the status board change as squadrons engage. Break off, land to refuel and rearm, scramble again. The system is working, but it's stretched to its absolute limit. He can see it in Park's face, in the tension in the room. They're throwing everything they have at this raid, and if the Germans come again before the squadrons can refuel, there will be nothing left to stop them. He leans over to Park, asks quietly, "What other reserves have we?" Park doesn't look at him, keeps his eyes on the plotting table. There are none. The words hang in the air between them. No reserves. Every fighter in the sky, every pilot committed to the battle unfolding over southern England. If this fails, if the RAF can't stop this raid, the invasion will come. The barges are waiting across the channel. The German army is poised. All they need is air superiority, and they'll cross. And if they cross, Britain falls. Churchill sits back in his chair, feeling the weight of Park's words. This is the moment. This is the crisis. Everything depends on what happens in the next few hours, on whether these exhausted pilots, these boys barely out of school, can stop the largest air raid in history with no reserves to back them up. The plots continue to move across the table. Raids turning back, breaking up, scattering. The RAF squadrons are hitting them hard, tearing into the bomber formations, forcing them to drop their bombs early or turn back without reaching their targets. The status lights show squadrons landing, refueling in minutes, scrambling again. The ground crews are performing miracles, turning aircraft around faster than should be possible. By early afternoon, it's clear. The raid has failed. The Germans are retreating, limping back across the channel. The Luftwaffe has thrown everything it has at London, and the RAF has held. Barely, by the thinnest of margins, but it has held. Churchill returns to Downing Street in a strange mood, somewhere between elation and exhaustion. The RAF claims 185 German aircraft destroyed. He suspects the number is exaggerated, the pilots in the heat of combat claiming the same kills multiple times. But the exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that Britain has survived. The invasion, if it comes, will not come today. 2 days later, on September 17th, he receives intelligence that changes everything. Ultra-intercepts, decoded German communications reveal that Hitler has postponed Operation Ceylon indefinitely. The invasion is off. The barges are being dispersed. The German army is standing down. Churchill reads the decrypt twice, then a third time, making sure he understands. The invasion is off. Britain is not going to be invaded. Not now, perhaps not ever. The immediate existential threat, the thing that has haunted his nights since Dunkirk, is gone. He should feel relief, joy, triumph. Instead, he feels something more complex. The invasion may be off, but the bombing continues. The Luftwaffe comes every night, sometimes during the day as well. People are still dying. London is still burning. The war is far from over, but something fundamental has shifted. Britain is going to survive. He knows this now, knows it with absolute certainty. Hitler has tried his best to break them, invasion and bombing and terror, and Britain has not broken. That night he goes to the rooftop again, watches the bombers come in, watches London burn, but this time the fear is gone. He knows how this ends now, not when, not how long it will take, not how much more suffering Britain will endure, but he knows the outcome. Britain will survive, will endure, will outlast Hitler and everything he throws at them. The realization doesn't come as a single moment of clarity, a dramatic revelation. It seeps into him gradually over the following weeks as he visits more bombed neighborhoods, as he sees the same defiant spirit again and again. The woman in Stepney who lost her home but immediately volunteered as an air raid warden. The bus driver who kept his route running through bombed streets because people need to get to work, don't they? The children being evacuated to the countryside, waving from train windows, treating it as an adventure rather than a tragedy. In October, he makes a speech that reveals his growing confidence. Death and sorrow will be the companions of our journey, hardship our garment, constancy and valor our only shield. We must be united. We must be undaunted. We must be inflexible. The words are still grave, still acknowledging the suffering ahead, but there's something else underneath. Certainty. He's not hoping Britain will survive. He knows it will. The bombing continues through October, through November. The Luftwaffe shifts tactics again, targeting industrial cities. Coventry is devastated in a single night in November, the medieval cathedral destroyed, hundreds killed. Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester all take their turns under the bombers. The casualty lists grow longer. By December, over 13,000 civilians have been killed, over 20,000 injured, but Britain doesn't break. The factories keep producing, the ships keep sailing, the RAF keeps fighting, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the balance begins to shift. American aid starts flowing in, ships and planes and supplies. The RAF is getting stronger, not weaker. British industry is adapting, dispersing, becoming harder to destroy. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, is taking unsustainable losses, losing experienced crews faster than they can be replaced. Churchill sees all this in the intelligence reports, in the statistics, in the trends. But what convinces him most isn't the numbers. It's the people. Every time he visits a bombed city, every time he walks through ruins that should have broken the human spirit, he sees the same thing. Resilience, determination, anger, yes, and grief, but not despair. Never despair. On December 29th, the Luftwaffe launches one of its most devastating raids. Incendiary bombs rain down on the city of London, the old financial district, starting over 1,500 fires. The attack becomes known as the Second Great Fire of London, flames visible for miles, the sky glowing red. Churchill watches from a distance, sees St. Paul's Cathedral silhouetted against the flames, miraculously untouched while everything around it burns. The image of St. Paul surviving, standing defiant amid the destruction, becomes for him a symbol of Britain itself, battered, surrounded by fire and ruin, but still standing, still there, unbroken. In the new year, the bombing continues but with less intensity. The Luftwaffe is being pulled away, redeployed for other operations. Churchill doesn't know it yet, but Hitler is already planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, shifting his focus eastward. The Blitz will continue into May, but its back is broken. Britain has survived the worst. On April 27, 1941, Churchill gives a radio broadcast that reveals how far his confidence has grown. He speaks of the suffering Britain has endured, the losses, the destruction. But then his voice changes, becomes stronger, more certain. Westward, look, the land is bright. He's speaking of America, of the growing support from across the Atlantic, of his certainty that America will eventually enter the war. But he's also speaking of something larger, of hope, of the future, of his absolute conviction that Britain will win. The words would have been impossible 8 months earlier, standing on the rooftop in September, watching London burn, wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. But now, after seeing his people endure the worst Hitler could throw at them, after watching them refuse to break no matter the cost, he can say these words with complete conviction. On May 10th, the Luftwaffe launches its last major raid on London. Over 500 bombers hit the capital, killing nearly 1,400 people, destroying or damaging over 11,000 buildings. It's the deadliest night of the entire Blitz. But it's also the last. After this, the bombers don't come back. Hitler has turned his attention to the Soviet Union, and the Blitz is over. Churchill surveys the damage the next morning, walking through streets still smoking from the fires. The destruction is immense. Over 43,000 civilians killed, 139,000 injured. Vast swaths of London and other cities reduced to rubble. Over 1 million homes destroyed or damaged in London alone. The cost has been staggering, almost unimaginable. But Britain is still here, still fighting. And Churchill knows, with absolute certainty now, that Britain will win. Not quickly, not easily, but inevitably, because he's learned something fundamental about his nation over these 8 months of fire and terror. He's learned that there is no breaking point, that British resilience isn't a romantic myth or propaganda fiction. It's real. It's the bedrock of the nation, tested in fire and proven unbreakable. Years later, after the war, people will ask him when he knew Britain would survive, when he knew they would win. And he'll think back to these months, to the progression of realizations. September 15th at Uxbridge, watching the RAF hold against impossible odds. September 17th, learning the invasion was postponed. The long autumn and winter, visiting bombed cities, seeing the same defiant spirit everywhere. The image of St. Paul's standing amid the flames. The gradual accumulation of evidence that British morale wasn't breaking, that the German strategy had failed. But if pressed to name a single moment, a single statement that captured his realization, he might point to something he said privately to Colville one night in December, standing in the ruins of a bombed street in the East End. They'd been talking to survivors, people who'd lost everything but were already planning how to rebuild. As they walked back to the car, Churchill stopped, looked back at the scene, and said quietly, "They cannot break us. They've tried their worst, and they cannot break us. We shall endure. We shall prevail." It wasn't a speech for public consumption. No cameras, no reporters. Just a statement of fact, delivered with absolute conviction. The fear that had gripped him in September, the doubt about whether he'd made the right decision to fight on, was gone, replaced by certainty. Britain would survive because the British people were tougher than Hitler had imagined, tougher than Churchill himself had dared to hope. The Blitz would leave scars on Britain that would take decades to heal. The physical damage, the psychological trauma, the thousands of families shattered by loss. Churchill never minimized this, never pretended the cost wasn't terrible, but he also knew what the Blitz had revealed. That when pushed to the absolute limit, when facing the worst an enemy could inflict, Britain had not broken, had refused to break. And that refusal, that stubborn, bloody-minded determination to endure, was worth more than any number of tanks or planes or ships. In his speeches, he would speak of Britain's finest hour, of the courage and sacrifice of the few. But in private moments, in conversations with close confidants, he would speak of something else. Of the many, of the ordinary people who endured the bombing night after night, who pulled their neighbors from the rubble, who served tea in mobile canteens, who kept the buses running and the factories producing, and the nation functioning despite everything Hitler threw at them. These were the people who won the Blitz. Not through dramatic acts of heroism, though there were many of those, but through simple, stubborn refusal to surrender. Through going to work the morning after their street was bombed. Through volunteering as air raid wardens and fire watchers. Through making jokes in the shelters while the bombs fell overhead. Through treating the nightly horror as an inconvenience to be endured rather than a reason to give up. Churchill had bet everything on this quality in the British people, had refused Hitler's peace offers, had committed Britain to fight on alone, had staked the nation's survival on his belief that the British character would prove unbreakable. The Blitz had tested that belief in the most brutal way possible, and the British people had proven him right. So when asked what Churchill said when he realized Britain would survive the Blitz, the answer isn't a single quotable phrase or a dramatic proclamation. It's a progression of statements over months, each one carrying more confidence than the last. From the grim determination of September, we shall never surrender. Through the growing certainty of autumn, we can take it, to the absolute conviction of spring, westward, look, the land is bright. But perhaps the truest answer is what he said to that old woman in Stepney, the one who patted his arm while he wept in her ruined street. She'd told him, "We'll be all right, you just keep us fighting." And he'd replied, voice thick with emotion, "You magnificent people, you give me strength." That was the heart of it, the realization that he hadn't been leading Britain through the Blitz. Britain had been carrying him. The people he'd feared might break had instead proven unbreakable. And in that realization, in that recognition of the strength of ordinary British people facing extraordinary horror, with extraordinary courage, Churchill found his certainty. Britain would survive not because of brilliant strategy or superior weapons or fortunate circumstances. Britain would survive because the British people had decided to survive, and nothing Hitler could do would change that decision. The bombers stopped coming in May 1941. The immediate crisis passed. But the lesson Churchill learned during those 8 months of fire and terror stayed with him for the rest of his life. Britain's strength didn't lie in its empire or its navy or its history. It lay in the character of its people, in their capacity to endure, to adapt, to carry on despite everything, in their stubborn refusal to accept defeat, no matter how inevitable it seemed. That was what Churchill realized during the Blitz. And that was what he said in 1,000 different ways for the rest of the war and the rest of his life, that Britain would survive because the British people were, in the end, unsurvivable. That Hitler's great mistake wasn't underestimating British military power or strategic position. It was underestimating the simple, stubborn, magnificent courage of ordinary people determined not to lose.